and welcome to section 7.2, which is on bone, the major organ of the skeletal system. Here are your learning objectives. We've got quite a bit for this section. And first we'll mention the general functions. So our bones perform several basic functions. They help to support and protect. So they're protecting things like our brain. So our skull or our cranium especially is going to protect our brain. Our thoracic cavity is protecting our heart and our lungs. And our pelvic cavity is going to protect our reproductive organs and urinary structures. We have the levers, the bones serving as levers for movement. And we all know that that is going to work within our muscular system in order to accomplish that. We have the process of homeopoiesis, which is blood cell production. And this takes place within the red bone marrow, which is going to be connective tissue. And then we have storage of minerals and energy reserves. So within our bones, we have calcium and phosphate that we can also pull out if needed. Let's classify the 4 types of bones that we can create that's determined by shape. So first we have our long bones. So this is our example of a long bone, or it could be the humerus, the ulna, or even the metacarpals or phalanges. This type of bone means that it is greater in length than it is in width. And then we also have short bones, and our short bones are going to be equal in width and length. So this would be in areas such as our tarsal bones or our carpal bones. The next category are flat bones. We're going to find these mostly within the cranium. And basically, this is a type of bone that is flat or has a thin surface, might have a slight curvature to it. And lastly, we have irregular bones. So basically, if you don't fit within one of these 3 categories, you are within the irregular bone category. So these bones have elaborate or sometimes complex shapes. Best example of that is the vertebrae. And now we'll discuss the regions of a long bone. There are a lot of different structures when it comes to a long bone. So I even suggest drawing this out for yourself and labeling the structures and what their functions are. That is the best way to study this portion of this chapter. So we'll start off with the different regions. We have the diaphysis, which is this long portion in here. Essentially, it is the elongated and cylindrical shaft of our bone. It's going to provide leverage and weight support. And then you'll see in this cutout here that we're going to have compact bone on the periphery here, but on the inner surface will be the thin spicules of our spongy bone. You can also see that in here we have this space, and this space is called the medullary cavity. It's hollow and it's a cylindrical space that we're always going to find within the diaphysis or the shaft of the bone. And in this area, we'll find red bone marrow in children, but it's going to contain yellow bone marrow in adults. Now for the 2 ends of our bone, we have the epiphyses. So this is going to be the knobby region at each end of the long bone or widened portion of the long bone. So because this one is closer to the start or the origin of connecting to our skeletal framework, this is called the proximal epiphysis. And then down here, we have our distal epiphysis, which is going to be further away from the origin or further from the trunk. We're going to see that the epiphyses are composed of an outer thin layer of compact bone. So this is best seen in the cutaway over here. We have the compact bone, and then we have the inner region that is spongy bone. And at the very top of the epiphyses on both ends, you will see that we have articular cartilage. This is covering our joint surface. It's just a thin layer of hyaline cartilage, and this helps to reduce friction within that joint and absorbs shock within movable joints. And you may have noticed that between the epiphyses and the diaphyses, we skipped a region, and that is the metaphysis. So that is this portion right in here. This is a region of mature bone between the diaphysis and the epiphysis. You may have noticed this little line in here as well. This is where the epiphyseal plate would be found. Notice how here it says epiphyseal line, so that means something different. Epiphyseal line is made up of bone, and we will find that only within adults, whereas the epiphyseal plate, or as many of you may have heard it called as growth plate, is going to be found in the metaphysis and is a thin layer of hyaline cartilage. This allows the bone to grow in length. And we're going to get into that process in one of the sections in this chapter. Now, surrounding the bone, we have a periosteum. So you can see here is our compact bone, and on the outside of that is the periosteum. This is made up of a tough sheath that covers that outside portion, and it's divided into a couple layers. So first we have an outer fibrous layer, which is the light pink over here, and this is made up of dense irregular connective tissue. So this would be the same tissue that we discussed in that reticular layer of the dermis. The reason we have this tissue here is to protect the bone from surrounding structures. It also helps to anchor blood vessels and nerves to the bone surface and serves as an attachment site for ligaments and tendons, for, well, the tendon portion for muscles to attach to the bone. And then for the inner cellular layer, which is more of like a reddish tone in here, that's going to include our osteoprogenitor cells, our osteoblasts, and osteoclasts. So we'll talk about what those cells are in another section, but those are very important bone cells to make sure our bone is thriving and working properly. And then beyond the intercellular layer, we have this region with numerous collagen fibers, and these are called perforating fibers, and it helps the periosteum attach to the bone. If we look at the inside of the bone, so I'm actually going to go back to this region, or this photo, this figure, and if we look at that medullary canal on the inner portion, kind of where that spongy bone is, we have a layer called endosteum. So endosteum is right there. We can also find it on the other side here. So it lines that inner wall. And here is basically a magnified photo of what's going on. So this endosteum is going to cover all of our internal surfaces where within the medullary cavity. So notice how in the background here we have this spongy bone, and the space is going to be lined with the endosteum. So we do see incomplete layers of cells. Here is an osteoclast. We have osteocytes here, and little osteoblasts and osteoprogenitor cells. Again, we'll talk about what these cells are in a coming section. So what we just described were portions of a long bone, but our other short, flat, and irregular bones are going to differ in the way that they are structured. So we'll see that their external surface is composed of compact bone. That interior is made up of the spongy bone. And when it's set up this way, we call this spongy bone diploe, and this is what it looks like. And we have an internal compact bone as well. Notice that there is no medullary cavity present here. Now back to our long bone. We're going to talk about how the long bone gets its blood supply and innervation. By innervation, we're talking about the nerve that supplies that bone. So we'll start off with the blood supply first. Bone is going to be highly vascularized, especially in the regions of spongy bone. and our vessels are going to enter from the periosteum. So you could see this taking place over here. This bone is covered in periosteum, and we see this nutrient artery moving through a little hole here called the nutrient foramen. And that allows the artery to enter into the bone and a vein to exit. Now I know the vein is not pictured here, but use your imagination and you could see the network of the blood vessels here inside this medullary cavity and then moving throughout the epiphysis. Now for our nerves, we are going to have them accompany the blood vessels through the foramen as well. So that as well is not pictured, but use your imagination again. And that is going to supply the bone, periosteum, endosteum, and the medullary cavity with nerve impulses. And they're mainly going to be sensory nerves. Now let's talk a bit more about bone marrow. This is a soft connective tissue of our bone, and we mentioned how we have a red bone marrow and a yellow bone marrow. So our red bone marrow, also known as myeloid tissue, is hematopoietic. So we are going to be forming red blood cells using this red bone marrow. It is going to consist of reticular connective tissue. We've got our immature blood cells in there and fat. So we mentioned in previous slides that in children, the red bone marrow would be found in the spongy bone and in medullary cavity of long bones, whereas in adults, it's located only in select areas of the axial skeleton. And remember, well, we haven't really discussed the axial skeleton just yet, but you are familiar with these bones since we've been discussing them in lab. So your axial skeleton is going to include basically the bones in the axis of your body. So the skull, your vertebral column, the ribs, the sternum, the hyoid bone, and then your appendicular skeleton would be the other, would include things like your os coxa and the proximal epiphyses of your humerus and femur. Now for yellow marrow, this is going to be a product of red bone marrow degeneration as children mature. So you can see in this head of the femur, we have some yellow bone marrow on the inner portion and red marrow on the outer portion. Your yellow bone marrow is a fatty substance and it can be converted back to red bone marrow. And this takes place during severe anemia, which is a condition with reduced erythrocytes or red blood cells. And also it facilitates production of additional erythrocytes or red blood cells. And here's a good image too that kind of shows us the axial skeleton versus appendicular. Everything in red here, which I'm going to pretend the skull is all red. All of this in here is your axial skeleton minus the os coxa here. That, along with your lower limb bones and your upper limb bones, are going to serve as a part of your appendicular skeleton. Now let's do a clinical view here on bone marrow transplants. This is used when bone marrow is going to be destroyed through radiation or chemo. There's abnormal functioning of the bone marrow, and so you find a healthy donor which is a match for the recipient, and harvest their cells from the posterior superior iliac crest, or just the area of the iliac crest, and then these harvested cells are then injected into the bloodstream of the recipient. These cells are going to migrate to normal locations for red bone marrow and will hopefully regenerate the bone marrow cells that we need, so any of our blood cells. And like I mentioned, we have to be a match between donor and recipient, and this is because our immune system can attack those harvested cells as being foreign to our body. So if they attack those cells, you become very ill, and of course it doesn't accomplish the goal. Now back to our bone tissue. We are going to talk about the composition of bone. bone are composed of cells and extracellular matrix. So the first thing we'll discuss are the cells of the bone, and we have 4 different types. We've mentioned these a little bit before. We have our osteoprogenitor cells, or sometimes these are called osteogenic cells or bone stem cells. We also have osteoblasts and our osteocytes and osteoclasts. So let's discuss each one of these in detail. Our osteoprogenitor cells are stem cells that are derived from mesenchymal stem cells. I always say these mesenchyme or mesenchymal cells are like your inner 5-year-old. They can become anything that they want. So you could see here in this illustration, they are turning into osteoblasts, turning into chondrocytes, or even adipocytes. And this cellular division is going to yield another stem cell and a committed cell. So that committed cell is going to morph from an osteoprogenitor cell to an osteoblast. And blast, you want to think building. So these cells of the bone are going to build bone matrix or form bone matrix. Back to our osteoprogenitor cell before I get too much into the osteoblast, you're going to find these within the periosteum and the endosteum. Now I can talk about osteoblasts. They are going to form from those osteoprogenitor stem cells we just talked about, and their job is to build the bone matrix. Or, fancier way to say this is that they synthesize and secrete osteoid. This is going to serve as the initial semi-solid organic form of bone matrix, and then the osteoid later is going to calcify to make the mature bone that you are probably familiar with. These osteoblasts, as they're building their matrix, become entrapped within the matrix, and then they differentiate into osteocytes. So the way I like to visualize this is if you had a brick layer, but that brick layer starts to build the bricks around them. So it's almost like they're creating a little cylinder that they're going to live within. And so as it starts building, then it's stuck there and it can't go out and enjoy its young life. So it grows old there and becomes a mature bone cell, which is an osteocyte. An osteocyte is going to be derived from these osteoblasts, and it's going to work to maintain the bone matrix. It's going to detect where there's stress on the bone, and it can trigger new bone formation as well. Now our last bone cell is an osteoclast. These are going to be much larger cells. Notice how they're even multinucleated, and they are phagocytic cells. Remember, phago means to eat, and cytic means cell. So they're cell eaters, and they're going to be derived from a fused bone marrow cell. So I know we haven't gotten into our bone cell, not bone cells, our blood cells just yet, but if you're a little bit familiar from maybe a previous biology class, our osteoclasts come from monocytes, which is a white blood cell, and that white blood cell monocyte can differentiate into a macrophage. So that's where it gets its phagocytic quality from. Now notice how the cell has this ruffled border to it. That's going to help to increase surface area to exposed bone down in here. We'll see that osteoclasts are located within or adjacent to a depression or a pit on the bone surface. And we call this the resorption lacuna. So I always think of a lacuna as a home. So for instance, these osteocytes all live within a lacuna, and I'll reference back to that in future sections. And they're going to be involved in bone resorption. So I wanted to show you this figure here where you see these bone cells in a histology slide. So all of this pink and reddish is the actual bone, and notice how the osteocytes are stuck in here, maintaining the bone matrix. Our osteoclast is this large cell here with the many nuclei within it, and it's working to resorb the bone, or basically eat or cut the bone away. And that's a good way to remember how or the function of this cell. Osteoclast, C is for cut, so it's kind of cutting the bone away. We also have some osteoblasts, and you could see these cells are lined up on the outside of that bone matrix because they are secreting more matrix to build bone there. Remember, B for build. And so as it's building, it gets stuck within its matrix and becomes an osteocyte. And here are some other histology slides. I just wanted to give you some other views. So in here is all of our bone matrix. Here's our large osteoclast eating bone away. And then here are the osteoblasts building bone and our osteocytes stuck within the bone here. You have a couple examples of them. In this histology slide, here's our large osteoclast. This is our bone matrix all in here, this pink, and you can see these osteocytes are stuck in here. Now we don't really see any osteoblasts around to identify them. I guess no bone building is going on. Maybe these cells right over here, these would be your osteoblasts. Here is your bone matrix with your osteocytes stuck in here, and these are your osteoclasts. Okay, now on to the other component of our bone tissue, which is the bone matrix. And we have organic and inorganic components. So our organic components is that immature bone, that osteoid, that's produced by our osteoblasts. So here you could see is our bone matrix, and then here's a space, right? And along that space, all of these are osteoblasts, building bone and secreting osteoid. We are going to have in this osteoid collagen protein and a semi-solid ground substance that's made of proteoglycans and glycoproteins. This organic component is going to give bone tensile strength by resisting stretching. It also contributes to the bone flexibility. And we can also see this taking place over here where we have our bone and then our osteoblasts are lined on the outside secreting osteoid. Now for our inorganic components, it'll consist of salt crystals and calcium phosphate. It's going to interact with calcium hydroxide, and by doing that, we form crystals called hydroxyapatite. Other substances that are incorporated into the crystals are calcium carbonate, sodium, magnesium, sulfate, and fluoride, and the crystals deposit around the collagen fibers, and it hardens the matrix and accounts for the rigidity of the bone. So I really like this figure here because it shows us what bone would be able to do without its counterpart. So here, if we did not have the hydroxyapatite that we just talked about, then we would be able to bend this bone around. It would be too flexible. So this would represent concrete. Whereas here, if we didn't have collagen, then the bone would be very brittle and it would break easily. So that would be like your rebar. Now let's discuss bone formation. It's going to begin with that secretion of osteoid. So this photo on the right here is showing you where we have hyaline cartilage first, and then as we start to go through a process called calcification, we deposit those hydroxyapatite crystals, and the calcium phosphate ions are going to precipitate out to form those crystals. And the process is also going to require vitamin D, which will enhance calcium absorption from our GI tract, vitamin C that's required for collagen formation, and calcium and phosphate for calcification. At that point, we will have this calcified matrix turn into the bone formation. actual bone. Now for bone resorption, our bone matrix is going to be destroyed by the substances released from our large cells, the osteoclasts. We've got some proteolytic enzymes that are released from lysosomes in here within our osteoclasts, and they secrete that in order to chemically digest the organic matrix components. Our calcium phosphate will then be dissolved by hydrochloric acid that the osteoclast also releases. Our freed calcium from the bone and phosphate ions will then enter into our blood, and this typically is going to take place when our blood calcium levels are low. And we're going to touch back on this when we talk about hormones and how they stimulate our osteoclasts to cause bone resorption to release that calcium into our blood. Now a quick little clinical view here on Osteitis Deformans, aka Paget's disease. This results when we have a disruption between osteoclast and osteoblast function, and is characterized by excessive bone resorption followed by excessive bone deposition. So here we could see this skull here that has had too much bone deposited, and if you compare this man's limb over here, you could see it's much thicker than his other limb. Our larger osteoclasts are going to resorb bone at a higher rate, so we will see areas where bone is taken away, and then that newly deposited bone is poorly formed. So the most commonly affected bones throughout the body would be areas like the pelvis, the skull, our vertebrae, the femur and tibia, which you could see pictured over here as well as here. And symptoms would just be bone deformity and pain. Now we're going to take a closer look at compact bone and later spongy bone. So our compact bone is composed of these small cylindrical structures called osteons. So here is an example of an osteon, here is another, and then this is just one osteon over here as well. These are also called Haversian systems, and an osteon is known as the basic functional and structural unit of mature compact bone. You'll see that these are oriented parallel to the bone diaphysis, which we'll see in the next slide, and they appear to look like a bullseye target, which you can see pictured over here. And this is what we mean by saying it is parallel to the bone diaphysis. So let's start looking at some of the components of an osteon. So here's one osteon, here's another, and another. So each of these are going to have their own central canal. Here is one that's been kind of pulled out for you to see the structure. There's the central canal. You can see it's always at the center of the osteon and parallel to it. And notice how in this canal we have blood vessels and nerves that are extending through a channel. If you look at the outside of that central canal, you'll see these concentric rings, and these are called concentric lamellae. These are rings of bone, connective tissue, and surround that central canal, and is going to consist of collagen fibers. These are at 90 degrees from previous and the next lamellae, and it gives the bone strength and resilience. So you can kind of see the structure of the lamellae in here. Now when we take a look at just one of these osteons, you will see that within it are these cells, our good friends, the osteocytes. Remember that these were the mature bone cells that laid their matrix around them and then became stuck here in the bone matrix. They're going to be found in small spaces between these concentric lamellae within their lacuna. Remember I mentioned how the lacuna is like the house for the osteocyte. And this cell, once again, will maintain the bone matrix here. Now extending out from the osteocyte, we have these canaliculi. The term canaliculi just means a small canal. So these are tiny interconnecting channels within the bone connective tissue. They're going to extend from each of the lacuna and travel through the lamellae to connect to other lacuna and the central canal. So basically, these are little canals in order to exchange nutrients, minerals, gases, and waste between blood vessels and the osteocytes. Now, our central canal is not the only canal. We also have these canals that are moving horizontally or perpendicular to the central canals. These could be called perforating canals or Volkmann canals. And these also will contain blood vessels and nerves. Now, the concentric lamellae that we found in the osteon is not the only lamella that we have. We also have circumferential lamellae. So you could see this around the periphery of the actual diaphysis here. And we have an external one, which are the rings of the bone that run immediately internal to the periosteum. And we also have an internal circumferential lamellae. So these are going to be the rings of bone that run internal to the endosteum. Both of them are running through the entire circumference of the bone. So this would make like a complete ring around, whereas on the external portion, it would make a complete ring around the periphery of the bone. And then we have interstitial lamellae, which interstitial, you always want to think in between, right? So these are going to be the lamellae that are found in between our osteons. Now onto spongy bone. Our spongy bone are made up of trabeculae, which are going to be an open lattice of narrow rods and plates of the bone. And it's a meshwork of crisscrossing bars. So you could see that this trabeculae, they're just hitting each other at random angles toward one another. And this helps to form resistance to stresses placed on the bone. You could see that we're still going to have lamellae here within our spongy bone. It is within our bone matrix, and our osteocytes are found between the lamellae, and the canaliculi are radiating out from the lacuna that the osteocytes live within. So similar components here, but notice there is not a central canal, there is not a perforating canal either. And let's quickly just talk about the structure of hyaline cartilage. You'll see in this histology slide that the cartilage cells, known as chondrocytes, are scattered through the matrix of protein fibers. It's embedded in this background, which is a gel-like ground substance, which is going to include proteoglycans, but not calcium like we see in bone. This cartilage is resilient and flexible. It has a high percentage of water, and it's highly compressible and a good shock absorber, which is why we see it at the end of our long bones. Notice, though, how cartilage is avascular, meaning we're not going to see blood vessels here. Instead, nutrients will diffuse into the cartilage from surrounding tissues like our bone. And we're also not going to have nerves here in our cartilage either. Just like our bone cells, we are going to have a chondroblast, blast meaning building, that produces cartilage matrix. And you could see here in this illustration of hyaline cartilage, our chondroblast here is lined up near the perichondrium, which is similar to like a periosteum, and our chondroblast is going to build that cartilage. Our chondrocytes found in the matrix here are the chondroblasts that have built their matrix around and also have gotten stuck within the matrix, and they too live in a lacuna. So our chondrocyte has a lacuna of its own, and it too, just like our osteocyte, is going to work to maintain the matrix around it. Now let's go back to this perichondrium here. It too is made up of dense, irregular connective tissue, and it covers the cartilage and helps maintain its shape. So here is a histology slide of hyaline cartilage, and you could see in this outer portion, or the periphery, we have the perichondrium. We've got our chondroblasts that are building the cartilage matrix, and then the cells or the chondroblasts that get stuck within the matrix become our chondrocytes. And here's a nice table from your book, Table 7.1, that compares basically your bone tissue versus your cartilage tissue. So we could see that the cells that form the matrix within bone are your osteoblasts, within cartilage is your chondroblasts. The mature cells that get stuck within that matrix in the bone are osteocytes, and cartilage is your chondrocytes. And if the mature cells live in a lacuna, yes, they do on both tissues. And then if calcium is present, it's only present in bone, not in cartilage. And if there's blood supply within the mature tissue, remember bone is very vasculature, whereas cartilage is not.